Welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm afraid this is the first video in an awfully long time, and it forms part of a series or a group of videos I'm going to do on optional things that you can do that aren't really essential for bookbinding, but it's really specifically geared to people who are binding the books that I've produced, although anybody can use it. And I'll put a link to more about those later. What I want to show in this video is how to speckle edges, which you can see here. Now, this is a very easy thing to do. It's, I think, one of the easiest, probably the easiest form of edge decoration. Edge decoration is something optional, but it's a useful thing to do, mainly I suppose, because it protects the edges from getting dirty. If you look at an old book, you'll often see that they really become quite grubby from one's hands from use. So really it's a way of detracting from that. There are far more complicated ways of doing that, with marbling or gold leaf or 4-edge painting, none of which I'm capable of explaining, but speckled edges like this, or sprinkled edges, are really a very easy way of doing a simple edge decoration. I usually use acrylic paint. When I was marbling, I'd often use leftovers of paint from my marbling, but now I mainly just mix them. You need to thin them down. So what I'm going to be doing is, this is a salter that I'm going to speckle. I've already rounded it because I find that it's simpler you need to clamp it between boards, and I find that it's simpler to do when it's already rounded. But you can also do it before you round it, but in that case you need to be careful that you put a board at the edge here, so that you don't actually, or else with these I could do it, that your board doesn't go over the edge, otherwise you'll damage the stitching. But I find it easier to first round it and then do that. So what I do is I place it. It helps if you have boards that are either exactly the same size, or ideally just slightly narrower, or else just slightly bigger. But yeah, if you don't, you can always do two sides at a time if you've got boards that don't fit, or even one side at a time. So what I do is I'll place it carefully between my two boards, and then, okay, for the purposes of the video, I'll put it on there, and then you can find other ways of doing this as well, of course, but I will use 2 G clamps. Be careful that when you clamp it, it doesn't distort how it's rounded, if that makes sense. So I've got this between boards clamped fairly firmly. This is really to keep it in place, but also to keep the pages flat so that they don't buckle due to becoming damp. Now I've got my one color mixed, and I'm going to mix the other. Paint will vary, and so you'll really need to play around with what works best for you. This is a local South African acrylic paint. Oh, it's almost finished. Oh dear. You don't really need very much, just a sort of a squeeze, and then you need to dilute it. Now here really you're just going to have to experiment. I found that yeah, different paint works differently, but certainly you'll need at least the same amount of water as of paint, but probably considerably more water than paint. And then mix it very well. Of course, you can also combine colors or whatever. I mean, you can be quite creative with that. I'm using this very ancient brush with nylon bristles that are fairly firm, that I just find works well. A lot of people actually use old toothbrushes, but I found that this works well for me. But again, you need to play around. I would suggest then experimenting with a piece of paper to see how it's going to speckle. And different paints work differently, and some really need more water and some less. But if it becomes too diluted, then the color will be weaker, and it may also tend to run, which you don't want. But this seems all right. Okay, and what I then do, it's a bit awkward because of the camera setup here, but with it between boards, and usually with my lighter color, I simply start carefully speckling one side. Once you've done the one color, you need to rinse out your brush, and we'll do the second color. Just one point, if you're doing this with a Bible or a book with very thin paper, then it might be better to take it, let it dry, open it up and fan the pages at this point, because you could run the risk otherwise of having the pages stuck together, and then it becomes an awful hassle to separate them. But this is fairly thick paper, and I think it should be okay. And you'll really just have to get a feel, yeah, for the sort of size of your speckles and how thin the paint needs to be, and what paint works best, and also what brush works best for you. But it does, yeah, it needs to be something with fairly firm bristles. Right, I think that's okay. So that's done. I'd suggest normally leaving it just for a couple of minutes before you take it out, just to give it a chance to dry slightly to avoid smudging, although I don't usually find that it does. And just be careful with your boards, and excuse my very messy boards, but these are my paint boards. But yeah, be careful if, you know, in case you've still got paint on the edges of them or something, not to get it on your fingers. But here we have it. And then I'll just sort of fan it open so that anything that's stuck together can come apart easily. But yeah, with this there's not really any danger of it sticking. So that's, as I said, it's an optional thing to do on a book, but it's a very easy way of both giving it something decorative and stopping the edges from getting dirty. Well, not stopping them, but hiding them if they do. Right.